prompt to, the materials for this particular tutorial are not in Jupyter Hub, but they are in this GitHub repo that I will now post to, I guess, to general. So all the notebooks that I'll show are in here. It does require installing. Running these does require installing a software called Keras. That is sort of what we're going to talk about, and that in turn will install TensorFlow, I hope. But like I said, pretty impromptu. So if you want to follow along now, you can. If it works for you, then that's great. If not, we can set you up to install this. It's actually not too hard to install. These libraries are not too hard to install.
Is it on the GitHub repo also, or is it just on the GitHub?
It's not on the Jupyter Hub at all. You can download the materials from this GitHub repo, but we don't currently have any of this loaded into the Jupyter Hub. We could set that up on the Jupyter Hub, but it would take a bit of work just because installing the stuff in there is a little bit finicky. Yeah.
So this will download Keras for us? Or
This will not. No.
we have to download it?
You'll have to download and install Keras, and so I can say what it takes to install Keras is usually a pip install Keras. Fingers crossed.
Sometimes the data work.
Try that to see if it works. If it doesn't, then there's more work to do. But that might just do it, and then you can actually follow along with these examples. But if not, then we can sort of talk through this, and I'll sort of motivate this a little bit in what we'll do here. So let me motivate deep learning. So there's this really interesting wave of machine learning methods that have grown out of work in image processing, and mostly out of trying to solve problems in natural object recognition. So the standard natural object recognition task is one that's embodied in a big data set called ImageNet. Right? This is many images labeled as one of each image labeled as one of 1,000 categories. And the machine learning task that is typically people try to solve in that problem is to label the image correctly according to the object that is in that image. And that's a complicated task, and people have been using more, we'll call it traditional machine learning methods for many years to do this, and you'll learn about some of these methods tomorrow morning, and some of them work pretty well. But then at around 2012, people started proposing, well, even earlier than that, people started developing, maybe around 2009 or so, people started developing these what we call deep learning methods, and those have also roots way back even in theoretical ideas from even the 1960s. But you know, around 2012, it became technically possible to actually run these algorithms, these ideas, implement these ideas on this, and at that point, and from that point onward, these algorithms have pretty much beat the standards and keep getting better and better at doing stuff like ImageNet object recognition. Now, I think right now there's a bit of a question of how exactly do we use this with, say, biomedical imaging data. We can do a lot of things. Some of the work that I've done using these methods involves, for example, classification problems, right? So you have, in the case of the data set that I worked with, this is retinal imaging, so OCT, and we have a big data set that we've been working with, and has images of retina of a lot of patients. Some of them have some diseases, some of them are healthy, and we can classify using this kind of method. We can classify who are healthy and who are have AMD, age-related macular degeneration, just based on the image. But we're starting to develop other methods. For example, in that particular data set, we can take the images and we can segment out intraretinal fluid areas, regions in that, using these kinds of methods. So the methods go beyond labeling the image as a whole and beyond classifying them into different classes to labeling individual pixels in the image. So you can do a lot of things, and there are a lot of other potential applications that are coming. So that's just to motivate. I think, so it's very hard these days to figure out what software to use because there are a lot of options in terms of software. And in the work that I've been doing on this, we've settled on TensorFlow for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons is it's actually a pretty nice entry point into the world of doing this kind of work in terms of the API that the software has, and also the level of community support. There's a huge community, and Stack Overflow, there are many, many questions being asked and answered on Stack Overflow for every problem you might encounter. So the way this works is TensorFlow is what we'll think of as the back end, and Keras is actually on top of that providing a much nicer interface in terms of the programming to TensorFlow. So you call TensorFlow through Keras. But I actually will start with TensorFlow because I think you pretty soon, when you start working with Keras, you actually start running into TensorFlow as well. You start having to call TensorFlow to do certain things. So you'll see, I'll show you an example later on of pure Keras that has no any calls to TensorFlow, but that's usually not the case. That's not usually how you will have to operate here. So we'll start a little bit with TensorFlow, and we'll do something really, really simple. We'll deal with a classification problem with an image that has 2 pixels, only 2 pixels, and can be of one of 2 classes. So so here I'm importing this. There's a notion of a session. Things run within a session. It's not a standard sort of Python procedural programming API. Instead, you need to run things within the context of a session object. So here I'm starting this session object, and it'll become clear what that means. This context dependence will become clear when I show the code in just a bit. Here I'm taking some data sets from scikit-learn, and I'm importing some libraries, NumPy, Matplotlib, etc. And I have some configuration variables. Later, when you play with this, you can have, instead of just 2 labels, 2 classes of objects, and etc. You can have more, and you can change the batch size and number of training data points, number of testing data points, and so on. This is a helper function that will help us create data sets. It'll become clear as I run this. And so here's a first data set that I'm creating. So here's how this data is organized. Each axis here is a pixel in this image with 2 pixels. So it's really easy to show because it's only 2 pixels. It has only 2 dimensions. We'll expand this to higher dimensionality in a little bit. But for now, 2 pixels. And there are 2 classes. And you can see that those 2 classes are differ in terms of the intensity of these 2 pixels, so that you could really separate this. In fact, you could separate this with a straight line. So it's called linearly this kind of data is called linearly separable data. Now in here, I'm defining a function that uses TensorFlow in order to process this data and try to build a model of this data and maybe do the classification, solve the classification problem. I derived the size of things in here. TensorFlow variables are initialized as placeholders. So you can think of these as objects that the data will stream into these placeholders as we iterate through and solve the problem of fitting the model. It's an iterative process in this case. And these placeholders will hold the data that streams in within the context of a session, a TensorFlow session. And we have 2 of these that depends on the number of features. So number of features in this case is number of pixels, so it's 2, and number of labels, it's also 2. So this is kind of the output, and this is the input into the model. Okay, and our model in this case is a simple. So I'll write it down. Our model is y equals wx plus b, where w is a 2x2 matrix, x is a vector with 2 elements of the intensities of the 2 pixels, and b is kind of like a bias term, right? Because I haven't centered this, but you can get rid of this if you center the data. And then y is an answer in terms of it can be either 0, 1 if we think it's class number, the second class, or 1, 0 if you think it's the first class. That's how we're going to. This is called a one-hot encoding of this response. Okay, so that's what's happening here. We define, again, a variable. It's kind of a placeholder, and this is also a placeholder. So these are sort of placeholders, and this is another kind of placeholder. And then...
What is the shape dimensional in this system? What would be an example where none is the first dimension?
None in this dimension.
Yeah.
Uh, that's a good question. I'm not sure, actually, where we'd actually have something in there. It might be if you're feeding in batches with certain size, with a lot of data on that. So you have like 100 objects coming in into your placeholder. Here, we're kind of feeding them one by one. Yeah. I'm not sure.
So
The none
this,
is to allow for arbitrary lengths of inputs.
Oh, inputs. Yeah. I think it's if you're feeding in many dots, right? Later we'll have batches, right? And that allows those batches to be, like you said, arbitrary length.
so this is, in a sense, generating a feature vector for each subject, and then you'll batch it for multiple subjects later on?
Yeah, if you think of these points as each as an individual image,
Yeah.
the second is sort of fixed because there is two features.
Yeah.
The first one is not fixed and can be any number of. So our input in here will be a bunch of rows with 2 columns each,
Yeah.
and that bunch of rows will be a batch in the training procedure, and you'll see that in just a minute. And that's sort of how this is held. And the same shape will be here as well, because the output, the number of outputs that looks like that is also going to be dependent on how much you fed in as a batch. So W and B are going to be the variables that we will estimate from the data. We're going to fit the model to estimate the values of these variables. This is really is the implementation of this model. So mapmul is a matrix multiplication. We're multiplying W through by X. We're adding this bias term, also has 2 elements in it. So we're fitting a 2 by 2 matrix and 2 more elements, bias elements. So it was 6 parameters in total. We run this through a softmax operation, which pretty much derives out this. So if we first started by multiplying by 2 by 2 matrix and adding bias, we might end up with something that has numbers that are not 0, 1 here. When we apply softmax, we get 0 and 1. We'll get one that's higher than the other, and this will allow us to choose. The softmax allows us to choose which one. The higher one goes to 1, and the lower one goes to 0. That's what the softmax does for us. In the next step, we define a cost function. In this case, the cost function is called cross entropy. It's a way to define a distance between the result that we got as y hat, our current estimate of what the answer was, the y, which of the 2 classes this was, and which one it actually was, right? And this is a way to define distance between those. Y log y is the entropy. You could think of other distances. You could do an root mean squared error in here, and that would also work here. We're reducing a sum over a y log y hat. And our training step is to minimize. So we're trying to minimize this cross entropy. We're trying to minimize the distance between the estimated and the true value. And we're using something called the gradient descent optimizer to do that.
Are you not saying that y hat is either 1 or 0? And if it's 0, what's the logic?
Y hat is either 0, 1 or 1, 0.
Yes.
It's a 2 vector.
So what's the log of 1, 0?
Log of 1, 0. Good question. The log of 0 doesn't make sense, but
I don't know, maybe it's doing something like that. It's doing something.
I think it might be in modern space, no. That's not right.
it's 0. It's going to be 0, 1, and 1, 0 at this point. This definitely is 1, 0 as it comes in, and this is 1, 0, 0, 1. I'm not sure. Let's figure that out later.
So isn't that dependent on the b value? That's the reason why y hat.
No, at this point it already comes out as either I'm in 0, 1 or I'm in 1, 0. Let's puzzle on that one in a little bit. Let's run through this first and figure it out. Because we can go and look at it later, at some point later during this. So we'll try to answer that in a little bit. What we're using here is a gradient descent optimizer. That means that it's doing in sort of iterative incremental step towards minimizing this. It's finding the direction in this two-dimensional space, or sorry, six-dimensional space of the parameters that it needs to step at each point in time to minimize the cross entropy, this cost function.
But the data is two-dimensional, right?
The data is two-dimensional, and we're fitting 6 parameters because we have 2 by 2 W and 2 Bs.
Oh.
And we have 1,000 points to do this on, so we're doing fine in terms of number of parameters relative to number of data points. And here's part of what makes this a little bit of a weird thing, is that you need to initialize the variables within the session. So again, I told you before, there's this kind of this context of a session that everything works within. And then the training itself is we step and we go through number of epochs times the training size divided by batch size. So in every step, we're feeding in a batch of batch size into this thing, and the training occurs. And this is what happens. This is how it works, running this within this context of the session. We're running this train step, this thing that takes in the cross entropy, that takes in y and y hat, that in turn depends on b and on w and on y and on x. It all kind of funnels into this train step, and we run the entire train step, saying x is going to be the batch of the data, y is going to be the batch, this batch's labels, and the context is the session. So in every iteration through, we're running within the context of the session this train step. We're calculating the value of the train step, taking x and y to be equal to this batch's data and this batch's labels. So we go and we keep doing that.
So this is a more classifier kind of question. You said we have 1,000 samples, so we should be fine because we're estimating 6 parameters
Yeah.
here. What's a good proportion? Like, what would be?
Oh, that really, it depends on the specifics of the problem. It really would depend a lot on. But at least we have more data than parameters at the very least.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to get an idea for
You-
what would
Oh.
So that depends on the signal to noise ratio.
Yeah, it depends on a lot
So
of
if
issues.
signal,
Yeah.
you don't send as much data.
It's very, very context specific. Okay, so now I'm going to run that. So it goes, it initializes this thing, and bam, it trains this thing. The next function, so again, I defined this to be a function, and the next function that I implement here is in order to evaluate this function, this very simple linear model. And what this does is it does something very similar to what I just did, but instead of estimating W and B, it takes W and B as inputs, and it takes not the training data, but test data and test labels, and it takes the session within which the context of which this all happens, and it runs the same set of operations. It takes x to be something, and it takes y to be something, and it calculates y hat out of those parameter values. So in a sense, it takes a set of fixed parameters and it estimates y hats for this. And then it can calculate whether or not we got the correct prediction by saying whether or not argmax of y hat is equal to argmax of y. Yes. Right? So is the number that is higher over here in y equal to the number that is higher here in y hat? Right? Is y hat 0, 1? If y hat is 0, 1, is also y 1, 0. That's the answer to this question, and that'll be the correct prediction. And when we get the mean of those correct predictions, that's the proportion correct answers in this case. And again, we estimate accuracy. Everything funnels here in this function. Everything funnels down into the value of this variable called accuracy. And so when we evaluate accuracy within the context of session, that's the thing that it gets eventually calculated. And again, we do the same thing that we did before. We have a feed dict where we say, take the test data, take the test labels, assign those into x and y, and then run through and sort of funnel things down into the percent correct and evaluate that. And it evaluates to a pretty good number, so we can do this pretty accurately. Yes?
So I've seen this pattern quite a bit where there's this arbitrary number of epochs when you like feed this data set multiple times to the classifier, and sort of arbitrary, or I don't know where
Oh,
that
number.
number like of epochs is coming from.
Yeah.
And then people evaluate it on some left out data set. And I haven't really seen the pattern of using a left out data set to figure out, what's the stopping criteria before it starts overfitting. Is that something people do? Or
So yeah, we definitely do this where we split the data into 3 data sets.
Yeah.
We have a training data set, we have what we call a validation data set, and then we have a test data set. And we use the combination of the training data set and the validation data set to decide the stopping criteria. So we will only train the network on our training data, and every once in a while we will ask, how's it doing on that validate data set? So we will use the validation data set only to determine if we can stop now.
I see.
And that's when we'll stop, when it starts overfitting to the validation data
And
set.
then you would probably run fewer than prescribed number of epochs.
We can run it indefinitely in some sense and choose the parameters from wherever validation performance was the best.
Is the
That's sort of
overfitting
typical.
function pretty like once it tips over to overfitting, it's just increasing?
Not really, actually. And often it'll just plateau and keep going. The performance will keep going. This is a bit, of a sort of,
So usually what we do is we run the experiment for some number of epochs and we save the checkpoints.
Yeah.
So once it's run, then we look at our validation and training curves
Yeah.
and decide which checkpoint to use to test the data.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I see.
And it's kind of nice because then you can also look at the parameters at different points during this process and infer all kinds of things. Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
So the other question is like, I've seen this pattern a lot, which is this like, well, we have epochs, we have batches have sizes, I feed it serially, and I iterate over batches and over epochs. I'm just wondering, is there like a TensorFlow function or some sort of a helper that you do all this?
So this is what Keras is for, is to make all this much nicer. It may or may not answer your particular question, but this is I'm showing this because this is under the hood, and I think actually understanding sort of why Keras looks the way it looks depends on understanding a little bit of the mechanics under the hood.
I see, okay.
So it's like overly verbose for education purposes.
Exactly.
And I'll just add one more thing to that, which is that it often depends on the hardware you're running. So TensorFlow has been created to run on about 6 very different hardware architectures, including Google's TPUs. And the memory bandwidth or the memory available for any of these devices change quite a bit, which is what's related to the batch size, which is how much you can fit in memory to do things.
Yes, so the batch sizes will be dependent on what your data size is, how much memory you have, things of this sort, and it gets pretty hard at some point. At any rate, so just to sort of expose a little bit of the mechanics under the hood, yes?
My question, a very stupid one. Those things, they are always TensorFlow objects. They can't be like NumPy objects.
These guys, these TensorFlow objects.
Yeah, and you can't.
You can pull out their value, you can kind of evaluate their value within the context of a session. And that's what happens here. In this cell, what I'm doing is I'm running the session to get out the value of W. And the result there is a NumPy array. Right? So here in this cell, W and B are variables, these kind of TensorFlow variables that exist ephemerally. And don't quite have a specified value until you run them in the context of a particular session, and you kind of force them to be a certain value, which is the value that they had when you stopped the fitting here. When you ran, so here we ran 100 steps and then we stopped wherever we were, under the assumption that maybe that was good enough. We didn't do all this checking of what's the value right now, etc. We ran 100 steps and stopped. And that's the value that W currently has if you actually run it within the context of a session. If that makes sense.
So the whole sort of framework is more adapted for, like, if you have a constant flow of data coming in, right?
Yeah.
It's not really adapted. You can hack it for like a static set of data. That's not really.
But you're right. It's exactly the abstraction to think of is that actually what happens when you specify this code is the TensorFlow builds up a graph of dependencies between the variables. So if you want variable, the train step variable, it says, oh, wait, no, you first need to give me the cross entropy. And if you want the cross entropy, you need to give me y, and you need to give me y hat. If you want y hat, you need x and w, and you need all these things. And it builds all the dependencies. And then for a particular context, it says, okay, here are my dependencies. Did you give me a value for x? And the answer down here is yes, I gave you batch data. So everything goes back to the batch data and it gets calculated in this context. And you're right that what happens is when we iterate, this graph gets sort of recomputed and recomputed, the actual specific value. So it's less the context dependence. Okay, so I can do something like calculate wx plus b. That's sort of the value of something, and that gives me and running the softmax on that gives me the class. And I do that so I can show you that this is the estimate. This is the estimate on the test data of the different classes, and it looks like if you compare it to this image that I showed you way up here, it looks like this classifier does pretty well in sort of finding the straight line that separates these data sets. Okay? Cool. Okay, now I'm going to create a data set that's not linearly separable, right? Because there is no straight line you pass through these things that separates these, although it's clear that there are two classes here and they occupy different parts of the space of these two pixels that we were talking about before. And as it says here, softmax doesn't do so great. So now I'm feeding this new data that I created that has these moon pattern in it. And
is that generate data set because of TensorFlow thing or a Python thing?
No, that's a Python thing actually. Yeah, the data here is in memory in Python, which is relatively easy. So yeah, so you can see what this classifier tried to do. It tried to find the straight line that separates these data sets, right? You can see it here that it's kind of tried to find the best line it could. And that is because the model is this model. The model is a linear model. All you can do here is find a straight line. Here's another data set that's not linearly separable. It's got this kind of pattern. Also pretty hard to find a straight line through this thing. And this linear classifier that I called softmax does really terribly at this. That's the % correct. And this is the classification performance. It passes a straight line just outside the data and says this is all one class. Sometimes it does different things actually. There's some randomness here, so sometimes it will pass a straight line through this. And if you run this many times, you'll see that. Okay, so to solve this problem, one way to solve this problem, and so when you think about the problem of object recognition, for example, it's not a linearly separable problem. We know this also from sort of theoretical reasons in human vision. Our understanding of the human visual system suggests strongly that there's sort of what the visual system is doing is trying to find a re-representation of this data where you can linearly separate different classes. But to get to that, you have to do some transformations on the data. And that's pretty much what neural networks do as well. So here's a different approach, is a network that has hidden layers. And this, again, it goes back to theory from way back in the 60s that says that you can actually fit you can find the separating function between classes of this sort, even if it's nonlinear, provided that you have a neural network that has hidden layers. So I'll jump here to the function itself. There are a few things about how to initialize the weights that are not too important. What I'll show you is what this neural network looks like. What does it mean that it has hidden weights? So what it actually means is that there is a hidden layer in there that looks exactly like our previous network. And then there's another layer, the output layer, that again looks exactly like this one. And they're just stacked on top of each other. So you take this model and you stack it twice on top of each other, where the output of the first layer goes to the second layer. And now you have what you might call a neural network with two layers. Okay, so it's stacking together two of these things. There's a little bit more to it because there's also this activation function here. So the output of the first layer goes through an activation function on its way to the second layer. But one way to think about it is that it's really doing twice this operation. So the input goes to wx. So now instead of y equals wx plus b, I can write h, the hidden layer, activation is equal to wx plus b, and then y hat is equals to wh, or w2 h plus b2, right? So there's another layer with its own parameters. There are different w's and b's here and here. So it's now if we started off with 6 parameters on the first model, now we have more parameters, and it depends a little bit on. In this case, I think we have another 6 parameters pretty much. So we have w's and b's for the first layer, and w's and b's for the second layer, and
You could just combine those and you have one layer.
except for the activation function, which adds this nonlinearity in between them. But you're right that two linear operations are a linear operation, which would be a problem unless you have an activation function. So having this activation function, what that activation function does is it passes the h here through a hyperbolic tangent, which is this fairly nonlinear thing. There are other kinds of things you can do here as well, and it ends up mattering a lot what you do in this nonlinearity. We'll see that in a little bit when we look at Keras itself. So for the sake of time, I'll just show you that when you run this and evaluate it on these data, you can actually capture this kind of pattern in the data with this stacked thing. And so this is the most basic kind of setup for this deep learning. Okay, this is very shallow deep learning. And so what people realized, at some point, is that if you keep doing this operation a lot, you can actually start bending. Right? You can think of this operation as bending the original space in a way that finds some linearly separable representation of these data. You're taking the data, you're kind of incrementally bending it so that now classes are linearly separable in some new space that you've re-represented, right? Every one of these, you can think of it as a coordinate transformation. You do multiple coordinate transformations until you find some weird re-representation of the data where now classes are linearly separable.
Is that what the kernel?
It's a bit like the kernel trick in support vector machine. Yeah, this you can solve. This problem you could solve with a support vector machine using what's called the kernel trick, and maybe Jake will talk about that tomorrow. So it's true that there are traditional machine learning methods that would solve this problem.
But does this do more than that?
Yeah, so this now can deal with problems that are very hard for support vector machines to do, like object recognition in natural images, which is hard to think about exactly how you do. Although, yeah, that's pretty much what people were doing until these kind of methods came along. Was, I think, the state of the art was a support vector machine with some fancy stuff on top of it, and it did okay, but didn't do quite as well as these methods. So apparently they do more. Part of what's tricky about this whole field is we don't entirely understand what these things are doing because they're so complicated. If you start stacking this now and you start off with a pretty large dimensionality in your input, the number of parameters in one of these things is in the millions now. So it's hard to know what they're doing. Okay, let me just show you how this now is represented in Keras to sort of cut to where things get much simpler. Yes?
So I have a stupid question. In the example here, the x and y coordinates are assumed to be independent.
Yeah.
The features are assumed to be independent. So
That's not an important assumption necessarily, and they're not entirely independent. You can see there's
yeah,
some,
I mean, but okay.
but it's not necessarily an
It's
important
not
assumption.
necessarily.
Not necessarily an important assumption.
It actually could be very dependent.
Yeah, there could be a lot of dependencies.
It could be a line.
Yeah, and we know that in natural images there's a lot of spatial correlations and things of that sort. It's not white noise, right? Okay, let me show you what this looks like. So I'm doing the same thing in terms of generating the data here. So here's our linearly separable data set. And what I'm going to pull out of here are the training labels and the test labels. So this looks like this. It's either 0 or 1. Right? You'll remember that I had this representation first. But Karis wants something much easier, actually. Wants labels as 0 or 1. So these are the two classes here. And the same is true for train labels as well.
How does it handle multi-class situation?
0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,
So,
7.
I mean, if you, sorry, if the classes are not mutually exclusive.
Oh.
Basically, if you have multiple outcomes, you have to basically.
Yeah, if it's
predict
I think it can. So multi-class problems of this sort of. So here's a case of multi-class, and there are solutions out there in the literature. Multi-label, yeah. There's a really nice paper where they did classification of skin diseases from photographic images, and you could think of some patch of skin as having more than one disease, or diseases being related to each other. So now you have to start. It's more complicated for sure.
Maybe bid with several of those now, right?
Yeah, you'd have to fit several networks to the same data set, and now you do prediction through 2 networks and kind of figure out where you are in this space. So you'd have a network for classifying, I don't know, patients from controls, and then within the patients you'd have a network that classifies one disease versus another disease. That's kind of a multi-label thing, right? It's a patient, and it's also a patient who has AMD. So you built a hierarchy of networks or something.
You'd have to give it the information as to how many classes you're looking for, though.
Yes.
Is there a way to?
Here, this is what we call supervised learning. It's pretty
Yeah,
strictly
yeah.
supervised learning.
So
Yeah, we can't
there are
really
ways that-
derive
Yeah.
what are the classes. Here's some data, what are the kinds of classes you find in here. There are ways to do it, but it's really the classical paradigm here is what we call supervised learning, where we know the number of classes, and not only that, we know for each item what the class is that it comes from. Okay, so what Keras does for us is it takes that thing that I wrote in TensorFlow, and it abstracts away TensorFlow. And this context dependence will come in here as a very simple kind of context dependence. What was really hard in TensorFlow is you need to keep track of what are all the things that go into the context of a session and how to calculate those within the context of the session. And so here that's abstracted away. So you can say, I'm going to get a sequential kind of model. My model is going to be sequential. And there are going to be layers in there. Some are dense, some are activation layers, some are what we call dropout layers. They're just going to have these connectivity patterns. For example, here we're thinking of this model as a sequence of operations, and we have a densely connected layer. Densely connected looks like this, right? Where every one of the x's has a connection in principle to every one of the y's. It's sort of fully connected. But you can have something that's not as fully connected. And here we're densely connecting. Let's see the help. So yeah, we have sort of one unit in there. It has input dimensions 2, initialized as uniform, and has no bias in this case. And then I add another dense connection with an activation. So it's similar to my softmax model from before. It's not exactly the same, but it's very similar to the softmax. And now, instead of sort of plugging together my optimizer and my cost function, etc., I compile the function, which lets Karis then, under the hood, figure out how to do this. I could say, use a binary cross-entropy cost function, which is the cost function that I used before that we don't entirely understand, but seems to work fine for this problem. Use some optimizer RMS prop. There's sort of just off-the-shelf optimizers, and then give me as metrics the accuracy in the end. And the API that I use here actually is not the newest API, so I should update this, but it's similar. They changed when they went to a new version. And then I can go and say, okay, I've compiled this model, now fit the model for me. Here's some training data, here's some training labels, do 10 epochs with batch size set to something, and it goes and it fits that, and it goes from initially, so it tells me as it goes along, it tells me what the value of the loss function is, what the value of this cross entropy is, and also what the value of the accuracy, Qualtrics go away, what the value of the accuracy is currently. And you can see the cost function goes down, the accuracy goes up. I can go and then evaluate also this on a separate, this is cross-validation, I can separately evaluate on another test data, and it'll tell me what so this 92% accurate, okay. So that's nice. And I can use this to predict and do the same thing as I did before, or just sort of eyeball where did it put the straight line that it fit. So again, in this case I had two layers in there, dense layers, but actually it was just one layer of sort of this neural network. So it was similar to this original neural network with just one layer. And it can fit linear stuff, but as before, it doesn't do too well on this nonlinear stuff, right? You can see it's still trying to fit a straight line through this moon's data. And same for this, this circle's data. It also does terribly, and it tries to fit a straight line. See, in this case, it tried to fit a straight line straight through the data. There's really nothing good it could do here. So we can add layers to this. So here we're adding another layer. In this case, we chose some interesting activation functions in each layer. So we have one layer with 64 units, and the input dimensions is sort of how many dimensions are going to be in the data. We do some fancy thing called dropout. Dropout, what it means is it's a regularization technique. It just means that we're not fitting all the parameters in every iteration. We sort of drop out some of the units, and in some sense, we don't fit all the parameters all the time, and that allows us not to fit too closely to the data, not overfit. So we're doing.
How about to train with this sort of thing to get the right parameters? We have a neural network that trains this neural network to get the right parameters.
Sure, that to find these meta parameters. Yeah, that would be nice. That's a good idea. I like that. And that, as expected, it works nicely. It does pretty much what I did before, but you can see now the code is much smaller, easier to digest, and more importantly, now when we're going to start stacking these 20 layers deep, it's easier to understand what's going on. People have figured out along the way that there are clever things that you can do in terms of the connectivity of these networks, which would be very hard to implement straight in TensorFlow and become fairly straightforward when you implement them in Keras. Okay, let's see. What questions do you have about Keras so far?
Crashed.
Crashed.
It crashed?
No. So I'm going to just answer Cal's question. So one-hot encoding you can still use in Keras.
You can still use that. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Actually, I think the next example has that.
To do multi-label.
Yeah, maybe, yes.
It does work.
Okay, it works. Okay, I'm gonna go to the next. So this is all just part of the magic, actually. The other part of the magic is that people realize that we can be inspired, again, by our own brain in designing these networks. So part of the problem in the image processing thing is people for many years when doing image processing, doing machine learning on image processing, the standard operation was to try to derive out features from an image using a set of fancy designed filters. For example, you try to find edges in your image, or you try to find, you'd have a template for what I don't know, if you're trying to find stars in the image, you have a template for what a star looks like, and use that as a filter to find stars in the image. And part of what's neat about these algorithms is that these, what we will call the front-end filters, also get trained along the way. So the setting of these filters, you don't have to have a preconceived notion of what are the relevant filters for your problem right now. Those get trained along the way as well. And it turns out that there's some utility to train these filters as convolutional filters. That means that you're taking those filters and you're passing them along the entire image. So you have copies, basically copies of the same filter along tiling the full image, similar to the way that we have, you can think of our primary visual cortex as being a set of convolutional filters. You have basically a set of filters that tile the entire visual field that repeat the same operation with some, in our case, with some variations because of different spatial frequency and different size, etc. But it's similar in some, at least at some abstract level, it's similar. And so the next network that I'll show you implements this idea as well. So now, in addition to these dense connectivity patterns and the idea of the sequential network, I'm also bringing in these other ideas, this 2D convolutional filter idea and an idea of max pooling. The idea of max pooling is you're taking from a lot of these convolutional filters and you pool them according to a max rule. You kind of take the noisy, the loudest one wins kind of thing. Okay, we set some things. The data that we're working with here is a set of images. I think they're 28 by 28 images of handwritten digits. It's a very standard data set for this kind of thing, and apparently it's really not a good idea to use this data set for anything like this. Earlier today, I was still thinking about replacing it. There's this really nice new data set that this could be someone's hack here that has, instead of these handwritten digits, it has 28 by 28 images of clothing articles. So there's like a jacket and a boot and pants, and so you have 10. Like the digits, you have 10 different classes of objects, and they're all 28 by 28. You could pretty much replace all these handwritten digits with this new data set of clothing, which I should do in this tutorial, but...
What's wrong with using this one?
One thing is, it turns out this data set, there are some weird features about it, like the fact that for some distinctions, you only need information actually from 1 pixel. You can do really well by using just 1 pixel, which seems like... So now it's no longer a multidimensional problem. You think it's a multidimensional problem with a lot of variability, but it's actually a really simplistic problem. So things of that sort. But there's a whole list. There's a whole shopping list of complaints about this data set. But anyway, we're using it here because it demonstrates the pattern. So I'm loading this. Here I have now. There's Keras itself has this data set in the way that I can get training the images and then the labels, and for both test and train. This gives me the number of rows and the number of columns in the images, and then sort of reshape them and do some normalization, which is not that important. I'll come to the neural network though. So here's the neural network now. So this is a little bit more stuff going on. It's still a fairly shallow, deep neural network, but now it has all the bells and whistles that a deep neural network would have. It has a convolutional layer in the top, and then an activation on top of the convolutional layer, another convolutional layer, so now we're 2 layers deep with these convolution operations, another activation function. ReLU stands for rectified linear unit, and that's it's a linear unit, except at some point it's rectified, so it looks like this. So it has this rectification. It has like a threshold. You can think of this again being inspired by neural units as having sort of a hard threshold below which it doesn't do anything. And then we're pooling from this activation layer. We're doing dropout. We're dropping out in each iteration 25% of these pooling units, and then we're flattening this, and then we have a dense connectivity, 128 units, another activation, another dropout, another dense connectivity. And here at the last layer, the dense connectivity goes to the number of classes that we had, which is, in this case, 10 different kinds of things, because there are 10 different kinds of images. And we do softmax in the end in order to choose which of the digits in this instance it thinks it is. Yeah.
So it seems that you can get away without specifying the sizes of these layers in most cases, in contrast to TensorFlow.
The sizes. So I do say how many filters I have here, and I specify a size of the kernel. So you can think of the filter as being a kernel and has a certain size, and in this case it's pretty small. It's kind of a little, every one of these filters looks at a tiny little area.
Okay.
So everything is specified.
Yeah, and then you don't do any reduction until dense 128.
Until here, yeah.
Okay.
Sort of, everything is kind of derived from the previous things. That kind of.
If you shuffle all those lines and rerun, you get the same answer.
I don't think so. No, I don't think so. No, there's an addition here, right? It's model add, so it gets added sequentially. Right, okay, so in the same operation as before, I can compile this model. I can say, give me categorical cross entropy as the cost function. I use a different optimizer. Again, it's sort of off-the-shelf optimizers that seem to work. And give me some metrics. And then I can go in and train that thing. And now it's running, and you can see that this takes slightly longer. That's because there's a lot of samples in here. I'm doing training on, I think, 60,000 samples in this case, validating on 10,000 samples. So there's a training validation kind of separation. And it chugs along. It will run here 12 epochs of this thing. If I had a GPU on this computer, it would actually, without any effort, would run in seconds, which would be very nice. But given that I don't, then this will run for an hour or so. So having a GPU saves a lot of time when working with these things.
So if we go back to the model,
Yeah.
so every add line is not necessarily a new layer, yes? So you add a layer and then you add
It's new kinds of operations that go in there, right? So you can think of it as like, so you have a layer, and then on top of that layer, say here you have a convolutional operation, right? There's sort of these convolutional front-end filters for that layer. And then those convolutional filters, you could think of them as the first layer, and then they get passed through an activation function, this ReLU, rectified linear unit activation function. The output from these convolutional filters then gets passed to another set of convolutional filters that operate on the output of this thing,
So when you have
and then
a
they get
convolution
pulled.
layer that goes to the activation function and output of that goes to another convolution, does it mean that there are two sets of weights that will be adjusted between those? Before and after ReLU?
Well, there's these, you can think of these as weights. Right, there's sort of the convolutional filters and
From the input to that layer?
from the image into this layer,
Into this, and then
they're sort of outputs, right? They take in an image and they say this much of that in this image, and this much of that in this image, and this much of that in this
Yeah.
image. So you get another, what looks like an image,
yeah.
right? There's the sort of the neural image of that first one,
Yeah.
and we take that neural image and we fit it into another set of convolutional filters.
Yeah, so that fitting goes to ReLU, and
Yes,
there's
you're
a
right.
set of weights there that will be trained, yeah?
Yeah, I think there is a fitting that goes into this thing. Yes, I think
What
you're
you're
right.
learning is the threshold layer.
You
Each
train.
phase has a parameter and basically when it's feeding.
So you don't weight things before and after a fixed threshold of ReLU?
Yeah, I think that's
You
right.
just learn the threshold of ReLU to be. Alright.
Are there functions in Keras for visualizing this stack that you put together?
I don't think they're in Keras yet, but there is.
So if you use TensorFlow as a backend, you can use TensorBoard to both monitor the training and visualize things.
Yes, but there is also this thing, Keras Viz, that works with Keras to do things like visualize your convolutional filters. Here, these are filters that operate on RGB stuff, so they have color. There are these attention maps. Attention maps are this idea that you can give in a certain sample, and it says, oh yes, I think there is a penguin in here. The question you might ask is, what part of the image made you say that it's a penguin? And there's some idea about how you can derive that from the pattern of activation in the network and draw these attention maps. So there's a few visualization methods here as well.
So how do you design a filter? If it's just a physical solution, that's but maybe there are some stuff that you want to count as you have some knowledge of the
Yeah, so there's a whole set of work on combining these methods together with more what I would call traditional image processing, because people have spent a lot of time figuring out how to design, very cleverly design filters for particular domain problems or particular kinds of image processing problems. So there is a large literature on doing a lot of these things, and combining those things is sometimes very, very profitable. In particular, when you don't have a ton of data to fit these models, you're sometimes forced to say, okay, I need to derive somehow something from some other knowledge that I have about this domain, or some other kind of image processing knowledge, and combine those things together. So there's a little bit of work on that. Specifically in OCT, there's some nice in this retinal imaging stuff that I've been working with. There's a few papers where they can do really well with these methods, with very little data, provided that they also use some very fancy filter design methods on top of it.
So you could create your own convolution, something like that.
Yeah, I don't exactly know how to do that myself, but I think it's possible to plug in a front end that has some nice properties that you've derived in some different manner. Okay, what other questions do people have at this point? Yeah.
So just sort of like as from a very high-level perspective, how much, I guess, like, is there also like a totally out-of-the-box model that compares that would not require designing to layers? And also, in general, just how much keeping of these layers is necessary?
Let's find this. So one of the goals of my work on this stuff is, let's see. So I'm collaborating with a group in the, I'm gonna do a shameless advertising of something that's really far from done. Why not? One of the goals of my research in this is to make this much easier, especially for work in biomedical imaging. And so we have something that's very far from done, which is a library that we've been working on that has implementations of networks that people use in biomedical image processing problems. For example, this UNet architecture, that's really, really small here. UNets are interesting. So I told you about classification problems. I told you also about the segmentation problem. So segmentation, in the case of segmentation, so you can think about the networks that you saw me showing before as taking as an input an image, and then it kind of reduces down into a number of labels, 1 to 10. But you can actually build the network so that it's connected so that the input is an image and the output is also an image if you want to do something like segmentation. And that's exactly what this UNet does. And like I said before, if you do these weird connectivity patterns, you find that sometimes there are some weird connectivity patterns that really help. These UNets, which is an idea that we didn't come up with, but somebody else had demonstrated, what they do is that they have these weird connectivities between layers that are really far away from each other. So you start, it looks like a UNet because you're starting up here with an image and you go down and you end up with an image as well. And there's a connection that short circuits like this, and another one that short circuits like that, and another that short circuits like that. And it's relatively straightforward to implement in Keras. I shudder to think what it would take to implement this in TensorFlow, but you can see it's a lot of layers. So there's sort of about 10 convolutional layers in here, and then there's sort of these short circuits. So this line does the short circuit. So, and there's out there on GitHub, part of what's amazing about this field is that the entire scientific literature on this field is completely open in the sense that all the papers are published on arXiv. Nobody bothers to submit this to peer-reviewed publications because it evolves so quickly. And usually the papers come with full implementations on GitHub, so you can read the paper today, get the code, and do the next idea tomorrow. That's why part of the reason it's evolving so quickly is that everybody's doing things very openly.
What people publish on GitHub is more like the models when you're getting trained, and that's what
yeah, but also architectures.
They publish the machines, right?
Yeah, sometimes they will even give you the weights that they've derived once they fit to some particular problem. We did this with here we have this intraretinal fluid segmenter. Where is it? IRF segmenter. IRF segmenter is basically the weights plus the network. So you can run sort of a command line. You just run this thing and it will take an image like this one and give you the segmentation from it. And people do this, it's very standard in this field. More so among the people who are actually developing deep learning methods than among people who apply this to biomedical imaging problems, for the time being at least. But the hope is we'll all get there.
So for example, there are many models trained on ImageNet that are already available. You don't have to train
tons.
it.
And one typical thing that people do when they have just a little bit of data is they take an already trained model that has been trained on something like ImageNet, and they just trained a few of the output layers. So just a few of they think, oh, maybe the front end filters in this case are good enough. Let's just train a few of the output layers to do whatever classification I'm doing right now. So you chop off the head and you put, if you started with 1,000 classes, now you're doing 3 classes instead of, I don't know. I've seen this in like trying to classify different types of cells in imaging of cells.
And also, is the library like TF-Learn, is that for a similar library or do you have any thoughts on?
I don't know it at all, TF-Learn.
Yeah, well, then that's all I have to know.
Yeah, I think TF-Learn is an attempt to do something similar to Keras, and I think Keras has taken much more,
Yeah, that's what I was
has picked up much more support.
So when you were mentioning we're chopping off the head and trying to retrain on subsample your smaller data set, do you think, so I'm assuming it has to have relevance to what you're using your classification for, right? So
Not necessarily. So it turns out you can take, so this is the example that I was mentioning. You can take a neural network, a fairly deep neural network that has been originally trained on the ImageNet problem, right? Photographs of natural objects. And you can chop off the head and retrain that sort of last few layers to do a classification of images, of microscopic images of stained cells. And it will work really well. So something about those bottom, the front end filters, when this thing is deep enough, and then something about those front end filters is kind of generic enough to do a lot of different classification
so front
problems.
end meaning the first layer or like the last layer?
The front end, I mean the thing that gets the image input into it. Yeah. So those are, you might expect those to be things that detect things like edges, like color contrast, and I don't actually know that they are, but I have a strong sense that in the case of ImageNet, something that's deep enough and was trained on ImageNet would probably come up with something that's not too dissimilar actually from what the computer vision people design when they cleverly design filters for those things.
Easily available. You said they are, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can find implementations in many different frameworks of these networks.
So Karis's documentation has some very nice examples of doing this with at least the ImageNet stuff.
Yeah, Keras, the documentation for Keras is quite good. It has a lot of examples. This MNIST example is taken straight from the Keras documentation. All right, go forth and hack.
Sorry.
Or not. Go ahead, yes.
So this is more of an unsupervised system because this is a deeper neural network.
No, it's still supervised. The setting of supervised versus unsupervised is maybe a question for tomorrow morning.
Okay.
Is whether you know what the different objects that you get in are.
Yeah.
Whether you have labels for each
Yeah,
one. And
okay.
we do in this case, we do have that. And even in the case of the segmentation, we have labels in the sense that somebody went and
Yeah.
meticulously segmented those images, and we have training images where we know each pixel, whether it's an intraretinal fluid hole or not.
Thank you.
All right.